We live in an interconnected world. A dam built in Egypt blocks rich silt coming down the Nile into the Mediterranean and forever damages the Mediterranean fishing industry. Cotton, grown cheaply in the American South thanks to government agricultural subsidies, is shipped to China to be woven into shirts, then shipped to Malaysia to have colorful images screened on the fabric. The shirts are then shipped back to the U.S. and sold throughout the country. When they grow old and faded, people give them to charities who sell them to global distributors, and the used shirts end up in marketplaces in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. In Nigeria, moviegoers have their choice of American spectacle films in high-end theaters, musical melodramas from India in mid-level theaters, and Chinese action movies in the low-end theaters. Nearby, some bars and restaurants show locally made Pentecostal horror video films. Back home on TV, channels are filled with Mexican and Brazilian telenovelas, dubbed into English as well as some local languages. We talk about these interconnections using the term globalization, intensifying connections of capital, goods, people, images, and ideas around the world. For anthropologists, globalization is part of a deep, long-term historical process. From this long view, globalization includes ancient population movements across and between continents, long-distance cross-cultural trade, the wanderings that created and spread the many variations of such world religions as Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, and Islam, the diffusion of technologies, including Neolithic agricultural know-how, military technologies, numeracy, literacy, and science and philosophies. Most people, however, think of contemporary globalization as something new, in part because of the specifically modern technological and social elements that shape it in its current form. There are three keys to understanding contemporary global flows: communication technologies, transportation technologies, and Western capitalism. Communication technologies connect people in myriad ways. Fast and relatively inexpensive transportation has changed the ways people conceive of distance. Capitalism is an economic system that's based on private ownership of the means of production and market distribution of goods and services for profit.
I get the part about communications and transport technology, but why capitalism?
Capitalism is a system of ideas that has changed how people make a living, how they relate to each other, and even how they think the universe works.
The core of capitalism is market distribution, an exchange of goods and services, or trade, calculated according to a universal medium of exchange or value, which we call money, and carried out by means of a supply and demand price mechanism, which we call a market.
But isn't that a universal part of human nature?
No, market exchange is only one of many possible modes of economy.
For example, in some parts of the Middle East, entrepreneurs will ruthlessly exploit their customers, but they cooperate rather than compete amongst themselves. Many believe that too much competition and refusal to help out your fellow businessmen is a violation of religious notions about not being greedy, and can also lead to being cursed by the evil eye. But there are also practical advantages. A 2005 study showed that traditional businesses using cooperative entrepreneurship could outperform businesses run on Western competitive principles by college-educated entrepreneurs in tough economic circumstances.
The point is that capitalism isn't just about labor, goods, and trade. It's about ideas, which means it's about culture.
So if capitalism isn't human nature, how did it spread around the world?
In a word, colonialism.
Colonialism is the extended domination of one society by another economically, politically, and culturally. As the social critic and novelist George Orwell said, the 19th and 20th century European empires weren't like the ancient empires because they were in it to make a profit, not to make a conquest. Here's an example of how it worked. England had built up its commercial empire on textiles, using new technologies and labor relations. Britain's major cotton supplier was the American South. But in the 1860s, this market was no longer available. Egypt, however, was a potential alternative supplier. Britain paid such high prices for Egyptian cotton that it became increasingly unprofitable for farmers to grow anything else. And under the local land tenure system, large landowners could force those farming their land to switch to cotton. Soon, practically everyone was growing cotton. This led to spiraling inflation as more and more food had to be imported, but farmers could afford it because the price of the crop was so good. A few years after the Civil War, the South began exporting cotton again. At the same time, plantations in British India began cotton production on a much larger scale. World cotton prices plummeted. Farmers in Egypt couldn't feed their families. They, or their landlords, had to borrow money, and local branches of the Bank of England loaned it to them. But the Bank of England was itself heavily invested in the textile trade. Loans required that the farmers keep growing cotton, supposedly to ensure that there would be cash to pay off the loans. And soon, nearly all the farms were heavily in debt. By protecting the cotton trade, the British Empire thus came to dominate the local economy. The majority of Egypt's population were agricultural workers, and they didn't take the situation lying down. Bankrupt, penniless, and angry rural workers flooded into Cairo and Alexandria. They demonstrated and rioted. The Khedive of Egypt lacked troops to put down such large crowds. He called on British military for support. The British also provided the Khedive with political advisors to help him modernize his country and make it more efficient and prosperous. The Khedive and his political council became increasingly irrelevant to the political and social operations of the country. The British created police systems and courts, took censuses, reorganized the army, and revised the currency, all on European models. They created schools to educate an anglicized elite class to be judges, clerks, police officers, army petty officers, and so forth. The British government didn't even have to pay for most of these schools. Most of them were mission schools paid for by British churchgoers as part of what the British public understood as its mission to civilize the backward parts of the world. In the new cultural world created by the British, Egyptians who wanted jobs could find them in the police, the army, the courts, the schools, and the political bureaucracy, provided they learned to speak English, abandoned many of their own cultural practices, and adopted European manners and practices. This approach is often called cultural imperialism, a situation in which the ideas and practices of one culture are imposed on other cultures, which may be modified or eliminated as a result. And it's a powerful tool of cultural domination, making the subject peoples, especially the ones running things, believe that the system is natural and inevitable.
So nobody set out to conquer the Egyptians. That was just a side effect of making a profit?
Sure, and in a lot of countries, it was even more direct. India was colonized by a multinational corporation. The British government didn't take over until 100 years later.
As global capitalism grew, so did European empires. They reached their peak in 1939, just before World War II. But the Second World War effectively bankrupted the colonial empires, and in the 30 years following the war, nearly every colonial territory received its independence from its European rulers.
Okay, but that was a long time ago. What's it got to do with contemporary cultures?
In most of the world, cultures are post-colonial. The colonial past continues to shape a country's present.
Oh yeah? How's that work?
Ever hear of a place called Iraq?
Before World War I, there was no place called Iraq. Under the Ottoman Empire, there were 3 separate provinces centered around the cities of Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra. Each was dominated by a different ethnic group, religious practices, and economic activities. The southernmost of these, Basra, was of special interest to the British because of its oil fields and the oil refinery at Abadan at the mouth of the Shatt al-Arab River. It was sometimes said that the oil fields of Basra fueled the British fleet. That's why, when the Ottoman Empire joined the war on the side of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Britain moved immediately to seize Basra. The British Mesopotamian campaign was fought primarily with Indian troops, brought in from Britain's Indian colony, especially the 6th Poona Division of 11,000 soldiers. After a series of initial successes, the British advance was halted at the Battle of Ctesiphon, where the British lost 40% of their forces. Retreating to the city of Kut, the British were besieged and surrendered. Thousands of troops died in captivity. The British effort was reorganized under a new general, but it didn't matter. On November 1, 1918, the war ended. With its surrender, the Ottoman Empire effectively ceased to exist, leaving an enormous power vacuum that the European powers rushed to fill. When Britain and France divided up the Middle East, the British sought the mandate to deal with the provinces of Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul. The British knew a secret. a team of British petroleum geologists had discovered evidence of oil in Mosul just before the war, so they sought to combine the three provinces into a single polyglot kingdom of Arabs and Kurds, Sunnis and Shiites, Muslims, Christians, Mandeans, Jews, and Zoroastrians. In order to fulfill a separate wartime promise made to the Sharif of Mecca in Saudi Arabia, one of his sons was installed as king of this new country. The city of Kuwait was already a British mandate, had been since 1898, and since the Kuwaitis had fought alongside the British, they were allowed to maintain their independence. This meant that you had two separate kingdoms, drawing from the same underground reservoir of oil. While both were under British rule, there was no problem, but when they became independent, ensuring that neither country overpumped from their shared oil was a constant political struggle. This was the basis for the outbreak of hostilities in 1990 that the U.S. calls the First Gulf War. So you could say that the U.S. went to war with Iraq in 1990, in part because the British didn't include the Al-Sabah territory in their kingdom. That's one way colonialism still shapes the present. Another example is the surprise Americans had at how little the Iraqis supported them after they liberated the country from Saddam Hussein. What people in the U.S. failed to understand was Iraq's long history of so-called liberations. In 1918, Britain liberated the people of Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul from the Ottoman Empire, creating the Kingdom of Iraq and installing a foreign monarchy. In 1933, the colonels liberated the Iraqi people from the monarchy. In 1940, Nouri Said, with British help, liberated the Iraqi people from the colonels. In 1958, the Free Officers, led by General Qasim, liberated the Iraqi people from Nouri Said. In 1961, Abd Salam Arif liberated the Iraqi people from General Qasim. In 1979, Saddam Hussein liberated the Iraqi people from Abd Salam Arif. And in 2004, the United States liberated the Iraqi people from Saddam Hussein. How Iraq reacted to the United States after the Second Gulf War was shaped by a long history. Because history is never gone. Stories about what happened in the past and what those events mean for our present are always a part of people's cultural heritage. And our failure to know that history and to understand how contemporary people interpret that history has important economic, political, and cultural consequences.